I think we're live on Facebook and YouTube, and even probably my Facebook page. So I'm here today, folks, with my friend Julie Owens. I met Julie, golly, how many years ago? I don't even think Call to Peace had started, or it had just started. So probably 5 or 6 years ago, I met Julie through our friend Chris Moles, who told me about her. She turns out she lives just a couple of hours away from me, and I didn't know who she was, and she didn't know who I was, and she kept saying, "I'm so surprised I don't know about you already."
I know.
That's all you said the whole conversation. Um, so I'm going to introduce Julie as a pioneer in the domestic violence movement and world, and she's such an expert. I would say that probably Julie and I don't see eye to eye on on some things. I'm probably more conservative than you, Julie. I'm pretty sure, but that's okay. What I would love the church to do is to be able to say we might not agree on everything, but this woman has amazing information. She has research, and she's done a lot of the research. When you were out in Hawaii, you were part of the, tell a little bit
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. And I've done some here too. Well, I was at the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, which is part of the VA. I was project director on two studies where we looked at survivors of domestic violence with PTSD and developed a therapy to help eliminate their uh, guilt, which seemed to really keep the PTSD stuck, keep them stuck in PTSD. And so, and I've done other, research at other places too, but that was, I think particularly enlightening for me to realize that once a survivor can look back on the choices she made, the things she thought, the things she believed, and really sort of um, get some distance and remember only what she knew then rather than what she learned later and felt like, oh, I'm so stupid. I should have known that, like red flags and stuff like that, and trying to help someone understand at what point did you realize this was domestic violence? At what point did you realize it was going to get worse if you left? We do something called hindsight bias, where we remember ourselves as smarter than we were. We put our 40-year-old head in our 20-year-old body.
Yeah.
And so by helping just really analyze this, people were able to just let go of that and realize, hey, none of this was my fault. I was a twig in a hurricane. It's my abuser and the people who enabled my abuser, my pastor, the police, whoever, who are responsible for what happened to my children. I did everything I could to protect them, right? So that was one of the really exciting times in my career.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the book. It's called Healing from the Trauma of Domestic Violence. And I actually cited it quite a bit in my workbook. But what we were just talking about this too before we turned on the camera, that my healing process was very much through meditation on scripture, but it was the same idea. I had to tell myself that, there's no condemnation for me. God has, and believe what God had said about me instead of what my abuser had said about me. So I want to just go back a little bit too and talk about how you got into this work. So Julie, in a nutshell, without details, just tell us how the domestic violence got on your radar.
Well, I was a preacher's kid, but I was 32 when I got married, and my husband, who was great during the courtship, of course, as soon as we got married, was controlling and jealous and accusatory and mean, and all the things that you've probably heard about. Not physically abusive though, and we separated for 3 months, got back together. Um, Long story short, was got pregnant shortly after the wedding, and we were separated for 3 months during the my second trimester, really, because I just couldn't believe the way he was treating me. My parents had a great relationship. I knew it was wrong, and I wasn't going to live like that. So, we talked to pastors. He went to treatment. He did, we did all kinds of things. And when we reconciled, of course, it was fine at first. And then, started again, escalated like domestic violence always does, in frequency and severity over time.
Yes. Yes.
And by the time I filed for divorce, when my baby was 8 months old, he was starting to make threats about what he would do to me if I left him, so forth. But he had never hit me. So I didn't think it was domestic violence. And nobody I talked to, including pastors, named it as that, or warned me and focused on my safety. They all focused on saving the relationship. But what happened is after he moved out, he broke in and laid in wait and ambushed me and my father separately. I was staying at my parents' house, and beat us and stabbed us. And we were very shocked. My dad's this, very respected pastor and biblical scholar. I mean, nobody in our congregation could believe it. And it set us on a journey to learn about domestic violence and what it was, and try to train our elders and church leaders, and then start working with other churches. My experience was in 1988. So really in 89, we really got going full steam. And since then, I've had amazing mentors all along the way, like Dr. Catherine Clark Krieger, who's written so many great books, Dr. Nancy Nason Clark, the sociologist, who's done such great work, and Reverend Marie Fortune. I mean, just so many others who have taught me along the way. I've never stopped learning.
Yeah. And that's what I appreciate about you. So you have, you've been around almost the entire length of the domestic violence movement, almost, you know what I'm saying?
Not quite. It really started in the
They
70s.
did, but you know what? They didn't start shelters until about the 80s. It feels like, they started
The
talking.
laws started changing in the 80s and
Yeah.
all.
You've been around for the majority of it. And
I'm old. Okay, Joy, let's go. No, I say this all the time. Yeah, I am. And my sheroes are the pioneers, the people like the women I named. But, I was kind of like, the end of the first generation of the people
Yes, that's
who
what I guess I'm trying to say. Yes, you were the end of that first generation.
I started organizing survivors to do activist things, to do trainings, to work on changing laws, to testify in the legislature, to hold judges accountable, to do education, train advocates. The first thing I did was start a crisis team that went into emergency rooms to meet with victims who doctors who I had trained recognized, called us, because we wanted victims to. We knew what we wanted when we were victims, and most of the time what happens is somebody comes up with an idea and they think, oh, this will be great for victims, but they never ask victims and survivors if that's what they want. And they throw up some big expensive center, one-stop shop kind of a thing usually, and it's not what victims want.
Right.
And
So
that's really important.
Yeah. And so as we were talking ahead of time about what we were actually going to discuss here, Gabby Petito, that case came up, and you had no clue what was coming for you. And so you were attacked suddenly. I wonder if Gabby had any clue of what was going on with her. And I mean, he'd already put his hands on her because they called the police. So what I would like to know is, the same thing happened to me when I reached out for help. The police came, they treated it like a marriage issue. They tried to break us up and separate us. And sometimes it just made things worse because I called the police. And so let's talk a little bit about why people miss it so much. And I know that you watched all of the videos,
the body cam of the police.
And just talk about why people are so apt to miss domestic abuse without training.
Well, we're steeped in a victim blaming culture, Joy, and we're steeped in a patriarchal world, where men have been calling the shots for forever almost. And I think that you had a group of men, police, highway patrol, they came together, and there was sort of like this group thing going on. And they saw this young woman who was crying, and they saw her as hysterical, mentally ill. Of course, the abuser being cool, calm, and collected, and kind of, chatting it up with them. And they colluded with an abuser, but didn't know that's what they were doing. And they made big mistakes. Witnesses had said they had seen him hitting her, and she was trying to get into the van. He was trying to keep her out of her van, that there was a struggle over a telephone. I mean, this is all classic domestic violence stuff, right? And she told them, he grabbed my face. Well, she was strangled to death. So that was probably his attempt to strangle her in the fight. And he had scratches that were obviously defense wounds from her. And they just misread the whole thing because they were looking for what I think they expect, which is, women who are emotional and men who are just doing their best, just trying to put up with this woman. And
Well, you said that
what
when the police showed up, he was calm, cool, and collected, which shows us.
they always are. Yeah. He was
Yes.
a classic abuser behavior, and she was classic victim because she was taking all the blame, uh, saying, not saying anything bad about him. On the other hand, he was deflecting all the blame onto her and saying bad stuff about her. That is, that's textbook domestic violence. So, they missed that. And they what they were looking for was the primary aggressor. And nowadays we don't talk about that. Primary aggressors, like who hit first. We try to identify the predominant aggressor. That means you have to step back. You have to look at the pattern of coercive control in the relationship. You don't just look at who hits who. That's why, where I live, probably 1 out of 3 people who's arrested for domestic violence is a victim, because victims are always, seen as the abuser because they scratched or whatever. It's very common. I'd say probably 1 out of 4 women I've worked with over the decades, has herself been arrested. So while we've made some progress, we have a long way to go. And they got it wrong. They were talking about arresting her because she was admitting hitting him, and because he wasn't admitting hitting, they said, well, I guess we're going to have to arrest her. Of course, they ended up not doing that. But what they did is they called the domestic violence program in that town, had them pay for a shelter for the abuser for the night, and she stayed in the van, right? So although they were nice and polite and they spent a lot of time, they got it wrong. They got it wrong.
Yeah.
And she was dead within a few weeks,
Yeah. And so we see it's not just the police that get it wrong. The Call to Peace Ministries, part of our mission is to help churches get it right. And we see
Yeah.
that. I've seen that working with churches many times where they would say, I actually had a pastor say, well, we thought that he was abusive at first, but he got saved. And now we think that she's the abuser. Well, she was angry, and she was angry. And it turned out, because I had been working with her and I was actually asking her to gather some evidence. So I told her, in North Carolina, as long as you're part of a conversation, you can record it. So she was recording conversations in the house. And as I listened to those conversations, it sounded like he was abusing their children. So yeah, she was angry. And so
well, of course.
yeah. And so that makes it very difficult for people to see what's going on, because a lot of times as victims, survivors, we come across as angry and irrational, whereas a person who is coercively controlling, they can turn it on and off like a faucet.
Yeah.
So,
This is an interesting point because you always hear, well, he physically abuses her, but she emotionally abuses him. Well, Jacobson and Gottman, who did such great research, longitudinal 10-year study with 200 couples at University of Washington, and had them all hooked up to measure their blood pressure and everything as they were having conversation. Turned out every case, it was domestic violence, but they didn't know that. They thought they were studying marital conflict, high conflict. But what they found was that when abused women are angry and contemptuous, that does not constitute emotional abuse. That is a reaction to abuse. That is a normal, expectable reaction to abuse. That's what we call survival behavior. That is not emotional abuse. It's not done out of power and control. It's done out of fear and resentment. And that's a totally different thing. That doesn't make them an abuser. They might be doing things that they never would have done, that they never have done before, like cussing him out or even hitting him and stuff like that. But that's not really who they are. It's all a response to the violence. And somehow pastors, police, social workers in social services looking at child abuse, and courts that look at custody, family, they get it all wrong. They'll know that the guy is the abuser, and before the case is over, They've completely left him out, and they're honed in on her and what's wrong with her, and sending her to programs and getting her fixed, and what makes her like this, and they just totally forget that he's the one that is violent.
And I've
It's
seen that.
amazing.
I
And
know. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that. That's what blows my mind. But yes, what you talk about. Years ago when I was going through it, I was really involved in ministry in my church, and my husband barely came through the doors. And when everything started happening, it seemed like my pastor believed him even more than my story. And so really bad things had happened. You know, he had actually threatened my life and all these things, and burning up furniture and all that. So my pastor invites us in for marital counseling, which was a big mistake, right? We
same
know we
thing
don't.
happened to me.
Yeah. But when I get there, my husband looks at me and he says, "You don't care anything about our marriage." He says, "All you care about is impressing him." So, in order to prove that wasn't the truth, I screamed at him and I said, "I don't give a bleep what he thinks." And guess what that did?
And
It
all of a
made
sudden, you're the hysterical woman.
right. And so, because all I cared about was saving my marriage, you know, to me, my marriage was an idol. It was more important than even my life, I think. But that's
Yeah,
what
who's the one that's always making the marriage counseling appointments? Not the abuser.
exactly. Yeah,
We're the ones that are dragging them, trying to get them to
yeah,
change.
that's right. But we know marriage counseling doesn't work. So we just want to talk about how easy it is. I like what Dr. Deborah Wingfield says in our advocacy classes. She starts out at the very first day and talks about how domestic violence is counterintuitive. Means that what you see at the surface is not what's going on. And I feel like I tell people a lot that it's like looking at 10% of the iceberg. That's all you're seeing. And we know that 90% of the iceberg is under the water. We can't see it. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors. And so I'd like to probably just wrap it up. I told you we weren't going to go too long today, but wrap it up with some tips for helpers, people who want to help improve responses to victims of domestic abuse. How to get educated, and how to begin to recognize it, and then what to do when you do recognize it.
Right. Well, first of all, you do have to get educated, and you have to learn what the myths are, that it's caused by anger, mental illness, stress, uh, a victim who's provoked the partner. So getting educated by organizations that do really good work, of course, called the peace, and but also big, secular organizations. There are many in the country where you can get training to understand what it is and isn't. It's so important because most abuse is not physical, and learning about coercive control is absolute critical, because coercive control is extreme psychological abuse, and it's very common. And it's not just what the abuser does to her, it's what he takes from her. And so he takes her freedom, her liberty, her autonomy, her ability to pick her friends and what she wants to wear and where she wants to go and what she wants to do with her life and how she spends her money and all of that. So coercive control is it's so insidious, but you can't see it. And we need to work on getting laws passed against it. We now have 3 states that have dealt with it: New York, California, and Hawaii. And there are countries in the UK, for example, that have outlawed it. But that's a big problem. Nobody looks at that. We wait for somebody to get hit, and that's too late. We need to assess up front. So one of the things we need to do is what's called risk assessments. And that's looking at all the different factors that could play into someone being dangerous, because everybody's case is not the same. So victims and survivors and helpers can all do that. One of the big risk assessment instruments is free online, the Mosaic Assessment. And I encourage people to do it because it ranks the abuser in dangerousness and spits out a report and some recommendations. It's at the website www.mosaicmethod.com. That's just one of them. So we need to do risk assessments, and then we need to do safety planning. So we need to focus on safety. The biggest mistake is to focus on anything other than safety, anything. And not just at the beginning, but to stay focused on safety. This is the biggest mistake that mental health providers and faith leaders and others make. They are not focused on safety, or if they are, they get away from it. They go, oh, we did a safety plan. She wrote this thing. No, safety plan is a living document. It changes all the time because your circumstances change all the time. And you need a domestic violence victim advocate who's experienced and knowledgeable to help you with that. There are good safety plans, examples like on the website of the National Domestic Violence Hotline. But ultimately, I think that what we need to do is believe victims, support them, and refer them to the experts.
Yeah.
And all the time focusing on their safety. Our job is not to get someone to leave their abuser. That's their decision. Our job is to support them in whatever decision they make and to be there for them each and every time she comes back to us asking for help, because the abuser is going to cut her off from everybody. And if we're one of the people that goes, oh, don't come running to me, you already did that last time, blah, 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 then there's one less person that she has to, support her. And we play right into the hands of the abuser. So we need to be compassionate and non-judgmental. And we need to do no harm, essentially.
Absolutely. And so we had our church partnership program that I mentioned to you earlier, where we
very exciting.
Yeah, it's so exciting. And so we have 3 pastors on staff who will go in and they will help with churches. It's not that a church can't do anything to support a victim, but it's interesting. You talk about safety in your own situation. There was no physical abuse before you left, and then all of a sudden it escalated.
Exactly, and that's common.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is why if you can't just say, oh, it's just emotional abuse, because emotional abuse can be just as deadly. It can escalate in no time. And I've known multiple women. We have a friend here in the area, LaTanya Allen, whose husband, she'd married 11 years, and it was just emotional abuse. And then one day he walked into the house, killed both of her parents, and left her for dead. So we know that you cannot ever minimize it. When you've got these dynamics going on, it's always potentially dangerous. And so I completely agree. We have to always elevate. We always want to focus on safety first. And so many
part of the problem. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, so many times churches want to focus on marriages first, which, marriage is a beautiful thing, God ordained. And yet God always elevates people above institutions. And so I think we should do the same by focusing on safety and the well-being of somebody who is being oppressed in their homes.
And as I learned years ago from Reverend Marie Fortune, who wrote the beautiful little book, Questions and Answers for the Abused Christian Woman, the marriage is not sacred anymore after it's been violated. And there is no partnership there anymore. He's broken the marriage covenant by being abusive emotionally or psychologically or physically or sexually. And so what happened, I think we've just been indoctrinated to focus on, no such thing as divorce, no such thing as divorce. God hates divorce, God hates abuse worse. There's no question about it. Even if you look at the origin of that scripture and what it's about, you'll realize that. And so we need to look at the character of Jesus, who came here to set the captives free, to bind up the hearts of the brokenhearted. It's not just about finding a scripture. You can find a scripture to support or debunk anything. It's about thinking about who Jesus is and what Jesus taught us. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's our job. It's really pretty simple. And, if you can't do that in your marriage, you're not going to be doing it anywhere else either. You're just going to be, a fake. And if we can learn to identify domestic violence, then that's a starting point. Our laws are just about physical abuse. That's part of the problem. Because if you ask what's domestic violence, if somebody Googles it, they're going to find out it's physical stuff. But that's, it is about coercive control. It's a hostage situation in a lot of cases.
Yes.
And it's where the victim has had to trade her escape skills for coping skills because it's not safe to leave. She's not staying because she likes it or because she wants to, but because she knows, it's very dangerous to try to leave.
Hmm. Yeah. And so yes, you said a lot there. Tina is saying that she said, her pastor said, how can you work on your marriage if you're that far away? But he never asked me if I was safe. And that's what we're talking about here. And here at Call to Peace, we don't go in and we don't force our theology on anybody. We don't actually even have a public statement on divorce and remarriage. And part of that is that we will work within a church's framework as long as they're not hurting victims of domestic violence. And I've actually had a pastor who was permanent's view on marriage. And I thought, whoa, we're in so much trouble, because he looked at her at the end of, we had filled him in on what was going on in the situation at this woman's home. And he said, do you believe this marriage can be saved? And she said, not without a miracle from Jesus. And he looked at me and he said, do you believe it can be saved? And I thought, well, I know well, it's possible, but you ended up telling him, you got to have a groups for men and accountability. And even then it might not work. And he looked at me and he said, well, I don't. He says, I've worked with these guys long enough to know they don't want to change. He said, we're not going to worry about her marriage. We're going to worry about keeping her and her kids safe. So,
And that's the whole thing about it. If somebody doesn't take responsibility and admit that they're the problem, it's never going to change. And that's why most abusers don't change, because it's not a behavior problem, Joy. We know that. It's a belief problem.
yeah.
They believe they have the right and the responsibility to keep her in line, that they're superior, that they're entitled. And until and unless that belief is trashed and he has a new belief system around equality and partnership and mutuality, it's always going to be abusive in some way, always. And so understanding that's critical, because just sending him to anger management, it's not a feeling problem. Just sending him, to learn how to count to 10 before he hits her, it's not going to work. It's a belief problem. And that's why the batterer intervention programs is really the only hope for abusers, aside from God. And the only few abusers, literally, I can count on one hand in over 30 years of work, who I know who have completely changed. It was because they repented and they literally turned their lives around and became new people. They developed, they were remorseful. They accepted responsibility. They didn't expect anything from their victims while they were working on their stuff. They didn't harass her, bother her, anything. They did their work. And then they did their work between them and God, and between them and their partners. And all three of the ones that I'm thinking of right now are still married. And that's very, very unusual. It's not unusual that people stay married. It's unusual that the abuse stop in all its forms, the
Yeah.
control.
Right. Yeah, because sometimes we can get them to stop the physical abuse, and yet the other
Right,
still
right.
continues. But yeah, I actually have worked with a couple of men, and who have actually, I've seen the change. And
Mm-hmm.
what I think it usually starts with, it's almost like they have an epiphany where they realize, oh, they see what they've done, they see the impacts of it, but it is quite rare. And the other problem is there just isn't enough good help out there. I mean, I believe
Yeah, yeah.
a lot of the men have, it doesn't excuse it, but a lot of them have a history of trauma in their lives. Not all of them. Some of them just were spoiled by their moms and think that everybody in the world
That's
knows.
right. They're just the little prince.
Yeah, but
But that's why I love the work of Ty and Barb Schroyer, who developed the Christian
changing,
curriculum for batterer intervention up at Duluth. Where they created the power and control wheel, and because they've been there, they were young, and Ty was abusive, but he caught it early. I'm not minimizing what Barb went through, but now they teach other people about how to work with, I don't call them Christian, I call them church going abusers, because they're
yeah,
not Christ-like, but,
sometimes for sure.
and they know how to hold them accountable. And a lot of the secular groups, it's true, they don't know how to respond to when he spouts scripture and they don't, but these guys do, because they get it, all of it.
Yeah, that's great. And we got our friend Chris Moles, who has the Men of Peace groups that he started. And
Hmm.
so, and he's also trained in the Duluth model and
Yeah,
Emerge as well.
yeah,
So they're actually starting to do something where hopefully we're going to have more groups, because to me, a lot of the problem is just the huge lack of resources, just like I faced as a victim of abuse at the time.
right.
now you've got everybody and everyone everywhere seems like talking
Well,
about abuse and
I know
narcissism.
that's true. And it's hard to know where to go because nowadays everything's about narcissistic abuse. And that is an enormous problem. I'll leave it there if you want to do a session on it, we can.
You can
But
give two
it's not
sentences.
focused on safety. That's why.
Right. That's why. Okay, that gives the answer. Well, Julie, it's already 12:30. Time flies when I'm talking to you. This is a Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and I really wanted to bring you on just because I appreciate your expertise and knowledge about so many areas. And you guys, if you have questions for Julie, I have put a link to her Facebook page here in the chat or on the caption, I
And I
believe.
have a website where you can send me a message.
Yeah.
Joy, I just want to take a minute to thank you for what you're doing. I think the work of Called to Peace is absolutely amazing. You are the only one doing this kind of thing in the world that I know of. And I feel so privileged to be your friend and to be so close to your work. And I want to encourage everybody, if you are going to donate to an agency this month to try to make a difference for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Called to Peace is a great choice, because not only do they train pastors and work with, therapists and, Christian counselors and so forth, they provide direct services to victims. They'll go into churches with them to meet with their pastors. They will, help them financially. They will help make sure they get trauma therapy. So thank you, Joy. What an amazing, amazing thing you've done in a short span of time, too. I can't wait to see what the future holds for Called to
Yeah.
Peace.
This is, in my mind, this is such a God thing. It feels like he's just led every step of the way and sent the exact people we needed at every point of the process. And right now, actually, we do have a huge fundraiser going on. It's our biggest fundraiser of the year. And we have a $20,000 matching grant. So if anybody gives in the next couple of days,
Fantastic.
we're not anywhere near that. So please.
Every little bit helps. It'll get doubled by this matching grant. That's
Right.
amazing.
So 50 becomes 100 and 200 becomes 400. So please,
And
please.
you do so much with so little. You, it's amazing to me. There are agencies out here that are getting millions to deal with domestic violence from the government who aren't doing a third of what you guys are doing in terms of really helping change lives and save lives.
Yeah, and I think part of that is because of the amazing volunteers that we end up getting. We have a
Yes.
woman who finally came in because we were just growing so fast. We grew 600% between 2018 and the end of 2020.
Amazing.
And this woman says, your support group stuff material is very powerful, and I would like to help spread it. This needs to grow, right? And I'm thinking, yeah, but I don't have time. And I mean, we've
Yeah.
just been trying to keep up.
Right.
And she's actually volunteering right now and helping us get things organized. And we have 10 new groups starting because of her and doing the training and so forth. So God is providing. We know, because I believe with all my heart, this is his heart. This isn't
Yes.
this isn't something that I've done. There's no way in the world I could have done this without him being in it every step. I tell people all roads led to Call to Peace. I just feel like I would even close doors, like ministry doors slamming in my face, was part of the process that God used to get me to
Right.
finally listen to this call. It was a burning desire in my heart that wouldn't go away. And finally, I did something about
You're
it.
a voice crying in the wilderness.
Yes, and I have really felt like that, but less so nowadays. I was saying more and more churches are starting to listen.
Mhm.
It's really been great seeing our pastors interact with so many churches, and we'll go do training or just information workshops for pastors and church
Mhm.
leaders. We do a free one every quarter called Protect the Flock, and we've got one coming up at the end of this month. We'll actually be speaking up at a crisis pregnancy center in Roxborough, but it'll be live streamed. And then we will do it just individually for different churches if they ask.
Mhm.
We've trained entire church staffs here in the area, and we are willing to travel. We've been invited maybe to go out west in a couple of months and do some education with pastors and church leaders out there. But I don't. You're right. It's not that. I appreciate the fact that you're saying that it's phenomenal and all that. I believe it's phenomenal, but I believe it's such a God thing. But it's been amazing to me that the doors have just been opening, and only God could do that. That has nothing to do with us. But I don't know of anybody else who has support groups, especially from a scriptural, biblical perspective.
Online, yeah,
Yeah,
especially.
we have them online. We have some in person. We provide advocates. We have a 1-year training program with Dr. Deborah Wingfield, and if
I
people,
love the academy. The Advocacy Academy is brilliant.
yeah, so well, and Dr. Deborah, like God just sent her exactly the right time. She has
Oh,
30 courses she's written on domestic abuse and
love her.
advocacy. Yeah, and so if somebody finishes a year, then they can become eligible to become called to peace affiliated advocates. So we have volunteer advocates across the country. We vet them to make sure they're healed enough and they're knowledgeable enough and they're in a good place themselves. And then we work those cases with them. So we provide individual advocates for people who request them. We provide the support groups. And like you said, we will help people with therapy and counseling. But the ones who are involved in our support groups, we can't just help everybody out there. So you got to get involved with us and we will help you
Right.
in multiple practical ways. So anyway,
You know what? I just had a thought. I need to get you from the East Coast and my friend Rhonda Encinas from the West Coast in rural Idaho, who's a Christian who runs a volunteer organization she started that has 5 shelters, and they're
awesome.
all run by volunteers.
That's
You know,
fantastic.
this is just unheard of, the kind of work you
Yes.
all doing. I mean, with what you're doing online and in training and what she's doing in terms of sheltering women and supporting them and giving them that biblical counseling and support while they're in shelter. I have hope for the future. You know, there was nothing available for me when I was a victim 30 some odd years ago. So I do see progress.
Yeah.
I get discouraged sometimes, but I feel good when I see people like you who are really pioneering this field and you know, springboarding off of what some of us started you know, a
Many, many
long
years,
time ago.
a while back. Yeah. And I'm grateful even for that. When I was coming out, there were really, now there's probably 1,000 books on domestic abuse in the church. And
Right.
back then, the only one I could find was probably, I feel like, which was the first? Marie Fortune's book I found, or
Yeah, keeping the faith. That little book was given to me in my support group, 1988, and
mhm.
it's simple but biblical, right to the point, you know, and it answered a lot of questions for me. And that's what women need. They don't need advice; they need information and support.
Yeah, so and for me, coming out being so conservative, I went, "Oh, Reverend, I can't really read this," but I read it anyway because I'm thinking women can't be a
You know,
preacher.
God's pretty smart,
Yeah. Well, anyway,
and we can teach us in ways that we don't expect, and we need to
right.
be open.
I needed that information. It was life-giving information, and I'm glad that I got it. And so
She's
for
the
me,
true pioneer. Yeah.
yeah. So it was great information, and she did some good research on it, or was it her? Or which was your Nancy? Yeah, there was some great
Yeah,
research.
they do a lot of training on pastor uh what did you call it? Like they sexual abuse, you know, pastors who are take
Yeah.
advantage of women in the congregation stuff. They'll train churches around that, developing policies and procedures. So, you know, there's something, you know, all of these organizations like you and Faith Trust Institute and Rhonda's Priest River Ministries, you all have a piece of this. And you know, I wish I could roll you all into one, but you're all doing something that unique that nobody else is really doing, and it's absolutely essential and life-saving. So thank you again so much. And I love being with you, always do.
Me
I'm
too.
happy to come back anytime.
Well, we would love it. And we're going to come back sometime. We're going to talk about, maybe I'll just do this for our survivors, but we're going to talk about the guilt thing and how to
Yeah,
overcome that and how to overcome trauma through working through that. But we'll do that a
right.
different day. So thank you so much, Julie. And thank you, everybody. We've had a lot of good comments here.
Thank you, Joy.
Um,
Thanks everyone.
Somebody loves your glasses, by the way, and they appreciate the information.
Thanks, girl.
uh,
I can tell you where to get them.
Yeah. So I'll be putting the link on for donating. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Julie. We'll talk to
My
everyone soon.
privilege.
All right.
Thank you.